the Army taught me to lead by example, and if the soldiers can't eat, as an officer, you don't eat either. And so I feel guilty taking my mask off, but I feel worse wearing the mask. So, sorry. Ready, Christy? I offered to put plexiglass up for the clothing. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for that break. We're ready to bring the jury back in to do the defense proof, which my understanding is just a stipulation. How do y'all want to handle that? Do you want me to read it? Do we want to make an exhibit? Do you want to read it, Mark? Or? I'll read it. What I don't recall, I think there's a rule on this. Do you mark it as an exhibit or send it back? I think you mark it as an exhibit, but you don't send it back. I think that's what you do. Is that right? I think that's what you do. I think you read it into the record, but you don't send it back. All right. State ready for the jury? Defense ready? Yes. All right. Bring them in. And Mr. Sanchez, we're getting in the lunch hour. I know you're going to have longer than lunch. I will kind of give you a clue if you can wrap it up within 10 minutes of that, just a break for lunch. Thanks. All right, everyone, you may be seated. Does the state waive the call of jury? Yes. Defense waive the call? Yes. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for that break. We're ready to continue with our trial. If you recall, when we last left off, the state had concluded its case in chief. Once again, the defendant has no burden of proof in this case, but he is given an opportunity to present evidence to witnesses and exhibits if he wishes to do so. So this is his opportunity. At this time, Mr. Halstead, Mr. Stevens, do you wish to present evidence on behalf of the defendant? All right, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, the parties have agreed to a stipulation, and what a stipulation is, it means they agree to certain facts, and I'm going to read the stipulation into the record. You can consider it as if it was testimony presented to you. The parties have agreed to stipulate to the following facts. On Tuesday, October 29, 2016, the defendant, Joel Guy, was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, for the murders of his parents, Lisa and Joel Guy. He was booked into the East Baton Rouge Parish Prison on the same day. During the booking process, his fingerprints and palm prints were taken and entered into the AFIS automated fingerprint information system. Brad Park lifted a palm print and fingerprint from the crime scene on Golden View Way in Knoxville, Tennessee, and entered that unknown print into the AFIS system and received a list of possible matches, including the defendant, Joel Michael Guy. Joel Guy's prints were in the AFIS system because he had been arrested on this case prior to Brad Park's inquiry. Joel Guy has no prior criminal record, and that is the stipulation. Does the state so stipulate? All right, so we will enter that. Any further proof on behalf of the defense? All right, ladies and gentlemen, at this point you have received all the evidence that will be presented to you to decide this case. The next part of the trial will be the closing statements of the attorneys. As I told you at the beginning of our trial, statements of attorneys are not evidence. However, they can be very helpful to you in understanding the evidence that was presented, as well as my instructions of law that I will give you after their argument. So I do encourage you to listen very carefully to what the lawyers have to say. Once again, since the state has a burden, they get to go first. If the defense chooses to present a closing argument, the state will have a period of time for rebuttal after the defense argument. It is now 11:30, and I don't suspect we're going to get through all the arguments before lunch. So we're going to hear the beginning of the state's argument. At some point, I will interrupt them, and we'll break for lunch and come back and hear the rest of the arguments after lunch. But I'd like to go ahead and get started now. So, General Sanchez, you may present your closing argument. I can do the can, or I can do these first row of LEDs. I want to try to do the first couple of LEDs. Oh, I guess. Is that good enough, General? Is that too dark?
I don't think so. I can see everybody.
Also, are you planning on standing at the podium, or are you going to move around? Okay, very good.
Confine myself if I could.
I do have a lapel mark if you need it, General.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just start by echoing Mr. Halstead here, who said to you in the beginning, thank you for being here, especially during these unprecedented times in the middle of a global pandemic. We are thankful that you're here and you're fulfilling your civic duty to serve as jurors in this case. So on behalf of the state of Tennessee, thank you for being here. As you're aware, this is State of Tennessee versus Joel Michael Guy, Jr. He is charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder for the murders of Lisa Guy and Joel Guy, Sr., 3 counts of felony murder for the killing that is committed in the perpetration of the killing of Joel Guy, Sr., and then for 2 felony murder counts for a killing perpetrated in the commission of thefts, 1 against Lisa Guy, 1 against Joel Guy, Sr., as well as 2 counts of abuse of a corpse. As you know, there's a great deal of proof in this case, a lot of evidence to consider. The best way for me to stay organized is to present this in a PowerPoint. So chronologically, what we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is Thanksgiving weekend, 2016. We know, based on text messages between Joel and his mother, that he is leaving Baton Rouge on the 23rd of November, 2016. He is heading to the parents' address on 11434 Golden View Avenue here in Knox County. We know, based on the testimony of Ms. Tyler, Michelle Tyler, the sister of Joel Michael Guy, Jr., that the family gathered on Thanksgiving the 24th. We further heard testimony from Joel Guy Sr.'s sister that on the 25th, Joel Guy Jr. is present in Burgoynesville with his father, Joel Guy Sr., one day after Thanksgiving to assist him in bringing a boat to the property. We know, based on the evidence, that the homicides occurred between the hours of 12:30 and roughly 3 p.m. on November 26th, 2016. In all this time, ladies and gentlemen, there's a plan in place. Joel Guy took care to plan these homicides accordingly. He went into great detail in how he wrote it out. So his plan, as you'll see and as the proof is demonstrated, was to kill his father first, wait until his mother was at Walmart, wait for a window of time where he could lure her upstairs and kill her as well. He then planned to manipulate the scene, even up to starting a fire. He had a guide for hot water heaters in his backpack in the guest bedroom that he was staying in. He had a plan to destroy the evidence. If you recall, and you'll see pictures, several areas throughout the residence, there are either a hair dryer or a hair curler next to a heater. What's the motive here? We don't have the burden to prove the motive, but the motive is pretty apparent in this case, and the motive is the money. He wants $500,000 that he is the second in line to get if Lisa Guy untimely dies. So if we look at the timeline of the defendant's travel, we know from the Vigilant Solutions exhibits that were entered in this case that he is seen driving to Knoxville, Mississippi, on November 23rd, 2016 at roughly 1:30. We further saw receipts in his trunk from Lieutenant Scott Henning when he inventoried that trunk that he had stopped in Georgia to go to McDonald's on the 23rd. Again, that would show his route of travel on the 23rd. Next, we know that he leaves Knoxville and is in Meridian, Mississippi at 12:31 on 11/28/2016, that being Monday morning, early Monday morning. He's again spotted continuing south towards Louisiana, Baton Rouge to be specific, in Heidelberg, Mississippi at 1:05 a.m. So when we consider how the defendant, Joel Michael Guy, Jr., became a suspect in this case, what the proof has shown is that upon the officer's initial response to the scene, they inventoried a horror scene, as they put it. You saw the proof, you saw the evidence of what they encountered inside that residence. You heard about interviews that Investigator McCord conducted with family members that put him on the path to establish that Joel Michael Guy, Jr. was present for Thanksgiving, and he was no longer there. We then heard about the receipt, the crucial piece of evidence that led investigators to follow up and to dig deeper into who the suspect was in this case. We saw the video transactions from Walmart, identifying Joel Michael Guy Jr. We saw his license plate as he left. That was at roughly 3:35 p.m. on the 26th at Turkey Creek here in Knox County, Tennessee. We learned that his mother was there roughly 3 hours previously, purchasing a long list of groceries that we ultimately found in the foyer area. So Investigator Jeremy McCord, he's with the Knox County Sheriff's Office. He was serving at that time in the Major Crimes Division. He responded first to a welfare check.
For work today, and I don't like her. I've tried calling her home number, I've tried calling cell phone, and can't get a hold of her. What can we do about that? Can somebody go by and check on them? Yeah, do you know her address? I do. It is 11434 Golden View Lane.
That is the basis of the response to the residents originally. We heard from Detective Ballard about how he responded, knocked on the door, rang the doorbell, went around back, whistled for a dog, again went to the door with no answer. Investigator McCord then received an additional call with more information about Lisa Guy supposed to be at a retirement party, as this was her last working week before she moved to Burgonsville. Some of the things he considered when he got to the residence: he found it odd that the house was for sale and there was no realtor box in the front door. He took that into consideration. He also took into consideration that both the vehicles that were registered to Lisa and Joel Guy Sr. were at the residence and no one was answering the door. He then moves around to the rear of the residence. He finds at the rear of the residence there's a back door with the doorknob absent, a hole instead. And upon investigating that hole in the door, he describes that he could smell chemicals and he could feel heat emitting from where that doorknob should have been. He further described that upon looking at the front door, the doorknob for the front door matched the deadbolt on the back. We saw that ultimately the investigator and accompanying officers were able to gain access into the garage. They were able to open one of the guy's vehicles and hit a garage door opener, which ultimately opened the garage. We heard about what he encountered once he opened that garage. He described that he could still feel heat, he could smell chemicals present in the garage. Ultimately, the officers make a decision based on what they've encountered to make an entry into that residence and conduct a welfare check inside of 11434 Golden View Lane on November the 28th, 2016. And you recall seeing the officers on the body camera with weapons drawn based on what they encountered outside. To make sure everyone is okay, they are processing the kitchen, or not processing, but kind of traversing through the varying rooms of the downstairs. At that point, Investigator McCord, if you recall, he said that nothing was really wrong there. There were some odd things I was considering, but nothing showed any signs of struggle. But it was concerning that there were groceries on the floor, the foyer. It was concerning that there were chemicals right when you came in the door. All that changes when they make entry into that stairwell.
Knox County Sheriff's Office! We're here to check your welfare!
And you recall when Investigator McCord testified about the kind of what he was perceiving at the time and how it made him feel based on what he encountered upon making it to the second floor of the residence at 11434 Golden View Lane. He stated, once we get upstairs, it's like the world does a 180. Everything gets turned upside down. He's initially seeing blood on the way up to the stairs, blood on the doggy gate, and then ultimately a horrific scene which will later become apparent, the scene where Lisa Guy was executed and subsequently disarticulated. He said he could see straight down the hall, and he saw hands not connected to a body. We also heard that from Officer Ballard, who experienced the same thing, as well as the other deputies who responded on November 26th. With regard to finding the physical bodies, in these tubs right before you, ladies and gentlemen, these two tubs, he described that as being gut-wrenching, something he's never experienced before. All the crime scenes that he's responded to, all the homicides that he worked, this one was different. He told us that he will never get those smells out of his head or his dreams. So when we talk about the charges with regard to this case, we'll start with the counts 1 and 2 being the premeditated first-degree murders. Now, the judge is going to instruct you as to what the state of Tennessee must prove to you, element-wise, beyond a reasonable doubt. We have 3 essential elements as it has to do with first-degree murder, premeditated first-degree murder, and those are: we have to prove that Joel Michael Guy unlawfully killed his father, Joel Michael Sr., and he unlawfully killed his mother, Lisa Guy, and that in doing so he acted intentionally, and that the killing was premeditated. The judge will further instruct you as to what the legal definition of premeditation is, and I ask you to consider that premeditation in the legal sense is exercise of reflection and judgment. It's thinking about things, what we're going to do later on in the day, what we're going to wear the next day for work. It's giving something some degree of thought. The legal definition for acting intentionally, ladies and gentlemen. A person acts intentionally when it's the person's conscious objective or desire to cause the death of the alleged victim. So we look at the instruments or the means on how these gruesome homicides were committed in this case. We know that there was at least 2 knives in the exercise room that were recovered, where Joel Guy Sr.'s hands were ultimately recovered. We know that there was further a knife next to the pile of clothes belonging to Lisa Guy. We know that there is a knife in the master bedroom sink. We know in the guest bathroom there is a United States Marine Corps K-bar knife. We know there's chemicals. We know there's other objects. And with regard to the $500,000, ladies and gentlemen, what this case is about in terms of motive, we know that there's a breakdown of beneficiaries where Joel Michael Guy Jr. is the contingent beneficiary, where Joel Sr. is the primary beneficiary on Lisa Guy's life insurance policy. And how do we know that Joel Michael Guy Jr. is aware of that? Well, first of all, we consider his notebook, his book of premeditation, where he identifies the valuation, the value, money, all mine, $500,000. He knows exactly what he's in line to receive if his mom were to die and if his dad were to die. When looking at that first-degree murder in terms of what we have to prove his identity, that Joel Michael Guy unlawfully killed, and so on and so forth. So with regard to identity, what you've seen, ladies and gentlemen, you've seen Joel Guy's written words. This book is connected to him through certain pieces of material, such as set her phone to send me a text message late Sunday to prove that I was in BR, being Baton Rouge, and she was, quote unquote, alive. We can prove his identity through his own spoken words, ladies and gentlemen. His admission of guilt as it relates to the homicides in this case. asked me how I could do this, blah, blah, blah. Submit to you what you heard there was an admission of guilt by Joel Guy Jr. We further proved his identity through fingerprints. You heard from Tom Finch and Brad Parks, who testified that they were on the scene at 11434 Golden View Lane on the 28th and after the crime scene was initially processed, and that's when they went about trying to lift latent fingerprints from within the residence. We also learned from the defendant's book of premeditation that he was trying to minimize his fingerprints when he was going to be there by the use of wearing socks and also gloves. It's apparent based on the photos that the defendant certainly wore gloves during the commission of the offense and after. We saw his palm print that was ultimately lifted from the left side of the guest sink next to the bag that had the Walmart receipt and the change from the medical supplies that he bought after he was injured in a struggle with Joel Guy Sr. And where that is, if you'll recall, in the bathroom here, the guest bathroom, there was a bunch of clothing here, a bloody shower curtain down here, various items here in a bag, a trash can here, a knife, a K-bar Marine Corps knife here, and a bunch of evidence that was analyzed through the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation over here. We saw the fingerprint, which was ultimately lifted and conclusively identified as that belonged to Joel Michael Guy Jr., the one on the left being the print from the scene, the one on the right being a standard. And they talked about, the experts, Mr. Finch and Parks, talked about the characteristics that they look for in peaks and arches when examining fingerprints and how they ultimately come to a conclusion that a given fingerprint was provided by a given source. And this fingerprint in the same bathroom is just on the other side of the sink. The CLOROX package, that being in the guest bedroom, in the closet area. Again, the print that was lifted, latent print that was lifted off that package. The left here being the print that was lifted, the right being the known standard of Joel Michael Guy Jr.'s print and how they were analyzed, and ultimately they concluded that Joel Michael Guy Jr. was the source of the print. The right middle finger print from the glove box. These are the nitrile gloves, ladies and gentlemen. These are the gloves that were not only downstairs in the kitchen, but also in the guest bedroom and also in the guest bathroom. And again, the same process was utilized in collecting all these prints, and they were ultimately able to determine that Joel Michael Guy Jr. was the source of the fingerprints. The right index finger from the medical tape that he purchased at Walmart after he was in a struggle with Joel Guy Sr. So how do we further prove his identity? We heard a great deal of testimony from Special Agent Kim Lowe at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She talked to you about all the pieces of evidence that she examined, multiple pieces of evidence that contained not only Joel Michael Guy Jr.'s DNA, but also the DNA of his parents put together. But most troubling, we learned that the notebook, the book of premeditation here, we learned that the major contributor is consistent with Joel Guy Jr. And we learned, she talked about, even broke it into quadrillions, about the number of being incorrect in the analysis. The knife from the master bedroom sink, where the stew-like remains of Lisa Guy and Joel Guy Sr. were ultimately recovered in these tubs, ladies and gentlemen, before you. The fingernail clippings of Joel Guy Sr. We learned that there was the presence of Joel Guy Jr.'s DNA underneath the fingernail clippings, or on the fingernail clippings of Joel Guy Sr. Again, supporting there was a struggle, an attack. So after identity, I want to talk to you about premeditation and how this case, how the state has proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Joel Michael Guy Jr. acted with a great deal of premeditation in these cold, calculated homicides of his mother and father. There's two routes I want to travel with regard to premeditation. The first route is the purchase of supplies used in commission of the murders. Okay? And I want to remind you, ladies and gentlemen, the proof has showed us that this began 19 days before these homicides took place. He was buying things that he was planning to use in the commission of these offenses 19 days beforehand. Another avenue of premeditation is, of course, the notebook. We know that he wrote about the murders, what he was going to do. You've seen the pages. What supplies he needed, what order he needed to do things, what he was going to do with the bodies after they were deceased, what he was going to do with the residents after his plan was carried out. We know he purchased supplies in preparation. We saw multiple videos of him not only in Baton Rouge, but traveling up to 35 miles outside of Baton Rouge to purchase supplies. We heard that Dan Boudreaux Ace Hardware is roughly 35 miles from Baton Rouge proper. And he had to find a place that carried muriatic acid in food-grade hydrogen peroxide. Sewer cleaner, number 2. Again, what's this about? This is about a motivation to collect money because his parents had had enough of supporting him, had never worked a day in his life, and they wanted to retire, and they deserved to retire. And we look at the supply purchases again. We'll start with supplies that were purchased the farthest out in terms of days from when the homicides occurred. 19 days beforehand, this would be November the 7th of 2016. He purchased several supplies at 2 different locations. So again, if you look at the left, Mr. Joel Michael Guy Jr., who Jerry Coleman, task force officer with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was able to determine that he was on the video on the 7th of November purchasing, if you look to the right, this is the physical evidence that was seized at the crime scene. So we have Mr. Joel Michael Guy on the 7th purchasing muriatic acid. We further have Joel Michael Guy on the 7th purchasing what comes in these tied-off bags because it's so dangerous, to skin contact and its ability to be corrosive to skin, food-grade hydrogen peroxide. If you see here, these are the big bags that are pre-tied. So those are just the purchases in Gonzales, again, which is roughly 35 miles outside of Baton Rouge on the 7th. But that's not it, ladies and gentlemen. The same day, Joel Michael Guy then goes to Lowe's. He purchases an Irwin pipe wrench. And we see at the crime scene in the master bathroom that the shower head has been taken off, that a hose has been applied to assist in his process of disarticulating his parents and ultimately putting them into an acidic-based fluid to dispose of their remains. He's also purchasing CLOROX wipes, same wipes that contained his fingerprints, same wipes that are found in the guest bedroom at 11434 Golden View Lane. So let's jump down the road closer to when he commits these murders. He takes a break from 19, and now we're at 8 days. 8 days before the murders. He's thinking about it again. This is getting real. Am I going to do this? He goes to Home Depot, Louisiana, 11/18. And what's he buy at Home Depot? Home Depot brand extension cords, as well as a timer. And we saw what the timers were intended to do in his book of premeditation. They were going to be utilized to create a fire after the bodies had dissolved. He makes another transaction at Home Depot, just minutes apart. He must have forgot the commercial bleach sprayer. And as you see on the right, the crime scene, we have the bleach and the bleach sprayer. The very next day, he's still thinking about it. 7 days before the murders. 1 week before he's set to come into Knoxville to enjoy Thanksgiving with his family. He is at Academy Sports in Baton Rouge. He is purchasing what you can see here, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, is the K-bar weapon, the Marine Corps style knife that he used to murder his parents with. Again, when you consider that with the evidence on the crime scene. So 2 days have passed. He's now 5 days before the murders. And what's he doing? He's at Walmart. You saw that video where he struggled to have the machine take his bill. And what's he buying? He's buying at least one of these. The proof is shown in the video show that he already had one. We saw him take the groceries and put them in the car and take a pre-existing bin, the same size, same color, same style, out, and place one of those bins in there and put them both in. He bought his parents' tombs on the 21st. On to the next avenue of premeditation. I told you about the supply purchases, but also the book of premeditation. The same book that has his DNA on it. The same book that he identifies that he will go back to BR so his mom's phone can be a program to set a text so she could be, in quote, alive. And what does this book do when you put it with the crime scene? Essentially, the writings, what they do is they corroborate everything that's out in the crime scene. So everything he set out to do, he did. Get rid of the bodies inside of the house. Well, the proof is shown that he did that, ladies and gentlemen, or at least attempted to. Get carving knives to make small pieces. Get knives because they're quiet. Get multiple of them. And again, we found at least 5 knives scattered around the upstairs of 11434 Golden View Lane here in Knox County. 5 knives that were used in the commission of these brutal murders. Get plastic sheeting for the disposal process. We saw the plastic sheeting in the master bathroom. Investigator McCord sure encountered that plastic sheeting when he made that awful discovery. The remainder of the plastic sheeting being on the guest bed that was neatly made. Get bleach denature proteins. Get plastic bin for denaturation process. Ladies and gentlemen, he had the supplies. We saw him buy the muriatic acid. Turn heat up to 90 to melt fingerprints and dry everything. Now, we saw a lot of crime scene pictures in this case from different crime scene technicians. We also saw video. So upon initial entry, if you recall, the heat upstairs was at 95 degrees. And after initial entry, it starts to cool down a bit. It goes to 93. It goes to 90. We heard about everybody who went in that crime scene. The medical examiner, Investigator McCord, the initial responding officers. We heard from Officer Ballard about his reaction to that heat on his face. The smell of chemicals. Turn heater up as high as it goes to speed decomposition. Okay, well, we know what he wants to decompose. The disarticulated, the brutalized bodies of his parents that are in an acidic-based fluid in the master bathroom. We also see a fan and heater that we heard on the crime scene video was actively working when officers initially entered. Wear gloves and socks to prevent fingerprints and footprints. Well, what do we find in the guest bedroom? We find a bag with Hanes socks. What do we find strewn throughout the residence at 11434 Golden View Lane? Gloves to prevent fingerprints. We've seen the proof is corroborated that Joel Michael Guy Jr., after he killed his parents, based on their clothing with the incisions in the clothing, he then decided that and planned that he was going to remove their clothes and take them away. And he did that by the use of scissors that were located ultimately right next to the pile of blood where he executed his mother. And how's he going to go about disarticulating his parents? At least for his mother. Turn on the hot water and point her to get rid of forensics. Remove her clothes and take them with me for disposal. Get a sledgehammer to crush bones. And if you look below the crime scene in the master bedroom floor, with a bunch of other various items that he brought with him through his shopping, is a sledgehammer. We also know that there was a blender in the master bedroom on the floor, a base and the portion of the blender that holds the content. We know that when he was arrested in Louisiana, that in his trunk, not only was there a gas can that exactly matched the other three at the residence, but there was a commercial meat grinder. So he did what he wanted to do. Place hair curler with flammable paper and flammable containers of gasoline in 4 locations. So that tells us that Joel Michael Guy Jr. brought 4 gas cans. And if you recall, ladies and gentlemen, I'm bringing one up to enter it into evidence. It's full. They're full of gas. And looking into that entry deeper, place hair curler with flammable paper and flammable containers. We have a hair curler plugged in. We have a hair dryer plugged in. Both next to heaters. He wasn't done, ladies and gentlemen. He was not done. He left because his plan was disrupted when Joel Guy Sr. attempted to fight for his life. Timer for flammables set for Friday at 10 a.m. Talks about how sunlight can mask fire, but not smoke. And the fact that everyone will be at work, they won't be able to report it. And we find on the scene, ladies and gentlemen, as well as we see in the video from Home Depot, he's buying a heavy-duty timer. Get rid of the blood in the crime scene. He knows there's going to be blood. He plans to attack his parents with knives. He knows there's going to be blood. Use peroxide and bleach. The peroxide has the ability to work against hemoglobin, a component of human blood, and the bleach has the ability to diminish the presence of DNA. And what do we find on the scene? Hydrogen peroxide, bleach, plenty of bleach. Bleach reacts with luminol, just like blood. Douse the area with bleach. And how does he plan to do that? With this commercial bleach sprayer that we watched him purchase from Home Depot on the 18th of November, 2016. 8 days before he carried out these homicides. And what does he do after this? Bleach by itself isn't going to work. What do we need? What we learned from Investigator Wassman, that a search was conducted on the artifacts of the home computer on the 27th. We submit to you that the proof is shown that Joel Guy Sr. and Lisa Guy were brutally murdered on the 26th. Leaves Joel Guy in the residence on the 27th. We know he leaves the late hours of the 27th into the 28th. There's a search on the 27th at 8:05 a.m. looking for sodium percarbonate, and the investigator told us that that is OxyClean. So with regard to first-degree premeditated murder, we've showed you, ladies and gentlemen, beyond a reasonable doubt, the identity of the killer, Joel Michael Guy Jr. We have showed you that he acted with premeditation, and we must also establish that he intentionally killed Lisa Guy, his mother, and Joel Guy Sr., his father. So with regard to Joel Guy Sr., we know that he was executed in the exercise room with apparent signs of struggle. Not only is the exercise machine overturned, but there's a futon present inside that room that has been stabbed. The blood patterns on the walls, we heard proof about how they had smears in them. There's clearly a struggle in this room. Again, going down the hallway where Investigator McCord and Ballard were able to see the severed hands in a praying-like position of Joel Guy Sr. So how do we get to that Joel Guy Jr. acted intentionally? What points us there? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we heard from the medical examiner yesterday, and she talked about that she was able to identify at least 42 stab wounds. And there may be more present, but based on the condition of Mr. Guy and the fact that his skin on his front side had essentially dissolved, and he was down to muscle, and portions of his skull had dissolved, she was still able to identify at least 42 stab wounds. And again, when you connect that with the legal definition of acting intentionally, a person acts intentionally when it's their conscious, objective, or desire to cause the death of the alleged victim. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you at least 42 stab wounds is acting intentionally. Again, we see that blood. We see signs of a struggle. We know that in the struggle, Joel Guy Sr. obtained several injuries to himself, either by trying to repel an assault or by physically grabbing the blade, knowing that he will be cut to stop an assault. What does the machine tell us? Points to a struggle. What does the couch or futon tell us? There was a struggle. But most damning, what does Joel Guy Jr. tell us when he goes to Walmart? He tells us there was a struggle. And ladies and gentlemen, you have this video for consideration. It's in evidence. I would ask you to look at his left hand and his inability, essentially, to use it. Same medical supplies that are ultimately found in the guest bathroom, upstairs level of 11434 Golden View Lane. There's so much of a struggle that Mr. Guy cannot pull his wallet out. If you see his hands, it's evident there was a struggle. Again, with regard to Joe Guy Sr.'s hands, ladies and gentlemen, again, we heard proof yesterday from Dr. Hawes, who established that these are defensive wounds in nature and that they were either obtained trying to repel an assault or grabbing a blade to stop an assault. But further, what did we learn? We learned that when Joe Guy Jr. was arrested in Louisiana, what the video didn't show us is the actual wounds. We got to look at them. We got to see how serious these wounds were. We saw the instruments of death that were used to murder Joe Guy Sr., used to stab him at least 42 times, used to create a gaping wound on the left side of his body, used to disarticulate him at the shoulders, at the hips, at the hands. And what was Joe's plan? Joe Guy Jr. Kill him with the knife. He did, ladies and gentlemen. Consider the torso, what's left of the remains of Joe Guy Sr. Again, previous to this had been dissolving, essentially, in acidic fluid. Saw some illustrations where the medical examiner was able to kind of explain the disarticulation of Joe Guy Sr. and where it happened, and also use this as a way to explain how those chemicals reacted with his skin and what they did to his body when he was face down in one of these tubs. She explained that his skin dissolved, again, that he was sectioned off of the joint. She explained that he had stab wounds that were at least 6 inches deep. Injuries of his lungs, liver, kidneys. We got to see his clothes. Joe Michael Guy Jr. was nice enough to not cut his dad's off, at least his pants. Saw the signs of stabs, cuts.
Yes, please. Okay, in the next 5 to 10, if you get a breaking point.
Actually, probably a good time. Yes, sir.
All right, folks, so your lunch is here. It's 12:15. I'm going to go ahead and interrupt General Sanchez. We will continue with his closing arguments when we get back. We're getting close, but we're not there yet, so do not discuss this case among yourselves or with anyone else. Please go with the officers. Enjoy your lunch. I'll see you here in about 45 minutes today. It'll be a shorter lunch today, 45 minutes. All right, let's recess for lunch till 1 o'clock. Be back at 1. General, can you turn that back on? I think